Hello friends, welcome to Coding Garden, and welcome to this preview of my course React Roots, which teaches the basics of building single-page web applications with React and TypeScript. If you visit reactroots.com, you can learn more, and if you click on the section, What Will I Learn in this course, you can see all of the lessons from the course, and specifically today's preview is from Lesson 4. And the learning objective that we're going to be covering today is use a consistent and predictable folder structure to organize code. So hope you enjoyed this preview. If you do, definitely check out reactroots.com to learn more about the course. Here it is. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was directory structure, because a lot of you had questions yesterday about, well, should it be in separate files? Should we put it in separate folders? And just like everything else, it's totally up to you. You get to decide. The React and TypeScript and JavaScript don't have any opinions about that. You can kind of do whatever you want. But I'm going to spend 5 minutes showing you some common patterns so you can make better decisions about how to organize the code in your project. So yesterday, you saw an example where in the source directory, I actually created a folder called components. This is standard. You see this in most React apps. And you can start to put your components that are used in multiple places in this folder. And the reason I say that is sometimes you have things that are not reusable, right? Sometimes there are components that are literally only used in like one section of your app. So it doesn't make as much sense to put it at this top level here. You really want to put high level things like a button, etc. And actually, let's just do that as an example. So I might have a button. And actually, let's do the name spacing thing that I talked about earlier. So let's actually prefix everything with app. So I'm going to have my app button. .tsx. I have a function app button that gets exported, and this will just return a button. We will take in a label, and then we're going to render that label right here, and then we'll also take in an onClick function, and we're going to specify that right here. Now we need an interface to describe this. So we'll call it app button props. Label is a string, and onClick is a function that takes in an event. We're going to talk about the types today, so I'm just going to use the any type and returns nothing to do. Fix any type. And then I can say that these props are of type app button props. Okay, so I have this button, and this is absolutely reusable, right? Because there's going to be multiple places in my app where I need a button, but now I've encapsulated it so that I can do things like I can put custom class names on it, custom behavior. I could even start to customize it further and say, well, this accepts an icon as well. Maybe it accepts an icon union of like thumbs up or heart, something like this. And so now this takes in the icon and then can decide to display the icon on there. And then maybe I call this app icon button. I don't know. All of that to say, because this would be used in multiple places across my app, that's why I would put it into the components folder. All right, you might also see something like utils. This typically only has like TypeScript code. You're not actually going to have any components in here. I'll say this folder contains helper or library functions that are used throughout the app. I'll also say this could also be named helpers. A lot of times people will call it lib, L-I-B, which is short for library. So library, helpers, utils, all of those are a similar idea, and those also will go at the top level. But you might have something like label formatter. And then this just exports a function that takes in a label, which is a string, and then, I don't know, it splits it on spaces, take in each word, capitalize the first letter, grab the rest of the word, and then join it back all together on spaces. I don't know. Basically, this is some function you might use in multiple places in your app where you want to capitalize multiple words. I guess we would do 2 lowercase on this one. Just as an example of something that might be used throughout your application. So label formatter, for instance, might actually go in like utils. The other thing you could have, and maybe this would also go like in like lib. This is all of your reusable library code. And so an example of that might actually be like an API function. So a file that has a bunch of API requests inside of it, that might go in lib because you're going to use that potentially in multiple places in your app. So this might be like api.ts, and then it exports a few functions. So we have something like get all, and then that would return, I don't know, like something. I'm trying to come up with example code, but also not take too long to write so that I can show all of this stuff. And then let's say we just return response.json. I don't know, something like this. But then maybe you also have like get one, and this passes in the ID as a string, and then we export these. So this goes in library because you might use it in more than one place. You might also have like math utils or whatever domain specific thing you're doing that might also be in library. Yeah, so API keys, typically that might actually just go, you might create something like a config in your utils. So like you might have config here, and this brings in a library for like schema validation, but this might export something like this, where you have like API key, and then you bring that in from your .env, but then maybe also you have like version number and you use that somewhere in your app. There might be other configurations that you might need in your front end app. We're going to talk about API requests tomorrow. So I'll definitely dive into like how do you deal with .env, and honestly, all of the apps that we're building in this course are completely front end. So you cannot hide your API keys unless you hide them in a backend proxy server, backend serverless function. Basically, you can't hide this stuff. So instead of super secret, this is like kind of secret. There are some API keys that you can include in client-side code, so that might go in here. And then over here in API, we might import the config. And then maybe we use that API key in our headers here. And so we say like authorization. I don't know. Config.api. I don't know. I really don't know. Oh, sorry. I grabbed from the wrong thing. I want to go grab utils/config like that. Yeah, we'll talk about environment variables tomorrow, but basically you could have a .env, but just know that .env is going to get bundled with your application. So you could technically do like process.env .react app API key, something like this. This potentially would bring it in from the .env, but again, when you build this app, it's going to be embedded, so that's something important to note. Yeah, so sensitive configuration basically has to be hidden in a backend if you really want that. Yeah, so components, lib, utils. The other thing you might see, so next week we're going to talk about routing, and you might also see a folder called pages. Now, this is also a convention like in Next.js, but if we're just using client-side routing with like React Router, you could do a similar thing. So in here, this will be all of the top level pages of the app. And so for instance, you might have like a home component. It is still just a component, but then this could bring in further components and like more like nested components. I mean, maybe we bring in that app button component. Yeah, I saw in the Twitch chat, someone was like, why'd you call it app button? A little bit ago, I talked about how if you have a lot of components in your app, you might run into naming conflicts. So especially when we're dealing with TypeScript. So basically like your type could be called button and your component is like app button. So I just talked about how you could prefix things to prevent naming conflicts. And the other thing you could do is like you could come up with an abbreviation. So this is the coding garden. So I could do like CG button or coding garden button or whatever your company name is, like, I don't know, Twitch. So if internally, you know what? I bet there's a TW button somewhere at Twitch. There has to be, right? Somewhere in their code base. But you can prefix it with whatever you want. The reason I came to this file is I actually don't want to specify onClick all the time. I'm going to make it optional. So if I make that optional, home will stop complaining about not having an onClick. For the most part, and for the apps that we're going to be building in this course, this is probably good enough. But one thing you could do is now as you start to have, in like next week, once we start having multiple pages, you can actually start nesting these things so that they're more specific. I guess the other thing is we would have, we talked about this earlier, but we might have a types folder. And this will have things that will be used across the app. So like maybe there's going to be a user interface like this. And so because this is used in multiple places, we put it in the types folder so that way we can keep things consistent. So any types used in multiple places go here. Okay, but here's the other thing to think about. As your app starts to grow, let's say you have 20, 30 pages in your app. And if you just stay with this one level of folders, things are going to get really messy, right? Because you're going to have hundreds of components in here. You're going to have hundreds of pages in here, hundreds of types. So what you can start to do is start to nest these. So in here, you can, for instance, instead of just having a home component, we could have an entire folder that has all of the stuff inside of it. So let's actually do this. Let's create another page called like the about page, but this is going to be a folder. And inside of there, we'll create an index.tsx because this is going to hold the about page. But also inside of there, we could have a nested components folder because maybe there's a component on the about page that is only used on the about page. And so we'll call this like about section component. And the about section, I don't know, just a div for now. But all the main point to see here is the fact that all of this component is specific to the about page. It's not used throughout the application. It's only going to be used right here. And so now we could bring that into the about component like this. and then render it out, render multiple of them if we had props or something like that. Yeah, and then we could prefix it as well. We could say like the app about page. I think like if it's a page, maybe we don't prefix it. And then this we actually could call like app about section. But again, I think it comes down to how you want to do things. But yeah, in terms of pages, I probably wouldn't prefix those just because they're unique enough. But components themselves, I actually would prefix. And then any level, anything else that is like only used in the about page, I might actually nest here as well. So like if there are specific helper functions or utils that are only on the about page, I might actually put nested folders here. So this is how I think about structure. I think the other thing, like you can go even deeper too, right? So instead of having top level components inside of components, you could actually have a folder called like app navbar. So you have a folder called that. You could have the actual component inside of it, but now that lets you put common things next to it. So this could even have subcomponents, or it could also just have like styles. So we're going to talk about styles next week. Technically, even though we import these here, these would actually still be global styles, but you can start to manage your components like in a nested folder as well. That's pretty much all I want to talk about in terms of like folder structure and where to put stuff. Any thoughts, comments, questions? I guess I'll also take input from even the Twitch chat. Like, is there something you do in your directory structure that you think people should know about or that you like to do that I didn't mention? Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, so TTV is mentioning where do we put our styles? Yeah, and so like if you're using Sass, you can basically use the same project setup you've ever used with Sass, like inside your source directory here. But you might also create like if you have global styles, it might also make sense to create a folder called styles, and then any styles actually go in there. So like styles now has index.css, and then we would actually have to fix that. So first of all, we don't have app CSS anymore, and then in main, we need to make sure that we import from styles CSS. But yeah, you basically group your global styles together. Again, in order to write styles specific to a component, it typically requires like an external library. So we're going to talk about that next week. Oh yeah, and then eventually when you get into like using like the context API or like using Redux or some sort of state management, you would probably have another folder that has all of your global state stored inside of there as well. We haven't got into that, so I won't create it, but yeah, that's something good to point out. Yeah, so and I think that's maybe something I didn't show in terms of imports. So like when I called this about page index.tsx, the way that I import it is actually just still about page. So let's say I want to bring the home page and the about page in here. Here, if I try to use about page, I didn't export it. So that's why the autocomplete couldn't help me. It was like, you didn't export anything. So notice this. So where it's defined is inside of pages about index.tsx. But so this is part of the module resolution. If you have a file named index, you don't have to specify it in the import. You can see that I'm importing pages about, and it knows to bring in that index file. Will this folder structure help page load? No, not at all. So this folder structure, and basically everything we're doing, is all about developer ergonomics, right? At the end of the day, I can put things in as many files as I want and in as many places as I want. But when we run this all through Vite and the build process, it's going to optimize everything to have the fewest number of files, the fewest number of bundles, etc. So all of I can do whatever I want here. And I don't really even have to think about, oh, well, how many files are going to get loaded on the client and stuff like that, because the build process handles all of that. The README file you created in each folder, is this how you do document project structure for project contributors or new joiners on the team? You could absolutely do it this way. I've never done this. This is my first time doing it because I thought this will be a good example because you can actually open up the code base and then look in a folder and it's like, hey, this is what this folder is for. Honestly, I should make a whole site. Has anybody done that? I feel like basically React needs some kind of style guide. There used to be the Angular style guide by John Papa. John Papa. I guess technically he did an Angular style guide for the more recent one, but that thing was like my Bible back in the day. Like it tells you common practice for like where to put stuff and all of that. So honestly, this would just be a good annotated code base to tell you where to put stuff. I'm not opposed to doing this in a code base with multiple people on the team, because yeah, this will help, especially a new person on the team. Like, what's this folder for? Oh, okay, that helps out, and then they can make a better decision about where to put the things instead of getting called out in a code review. Fallen Learns in the chat is mentioning they still use the John Papa style guide. I'll show it really quick because it's actually really good. Even if you look at the Angular 1 style guide, the application lift principle we should be able to locate our code easily, identify code at a glance. We should have a flat structure for as long as we can, and try to stay dry. This doesn't just apply to AngularJS. This applies to even like React code bases, even like backend code bases. And then it talks about specifically like with AngularJS, like how you might structure things by feature. So you have folders describing a feature, and then inside of that you have specific things as well. There's a lot of good nuggets of information, even in the Angular 1 style guide. Hello again. Thank you for watching this preview. Again, check out reactroots.com to learn more. I'll see you in the next one.